The wind at Iron Hawk Range never behaved itself. It came off the Pacific in layers, rolling across the scrub hills of Camp Pendleton like something alive, something with intentions. Old hands who had trained on this range for decades said you could never fully trust it. You could measure it, calculate it, feed it into your ballistic computer, and it would still lie to you at the last possible moment. The wind at Iron Hawk had humbled better men than most would ever be. Gunnery Sergeant Dale Holt did not believe in humility. He stood behind the firing line with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching his team of force reconnaissance snipers fail for the 9th consecutive time that morning. 9 shots, 9 misses. The steel silhouette at 1,750 yards downrange sat untouched, baking in the California sun, indifferent to the most advanced ballistic equipment the United States Marine Corps had ever fielded. Holt's jaw tightened with each miss. His eyes moved down the line, past the Kestrel wind meters, past the laser rangefinders, past the carbon fiber chassis rifles with their computerized scopes, and landed, as they always did when his patience wore thin, on the shooter at the far end of the line, Sergeant Maren Voss. She was lying completely still on her shooting mat, her cheek resting against the stock of her M110, her eyes closed. Not peering through her scope, not checking her data, eyes closed, like a woman waiting for something that had not yet arrived, but that she was entirely certain was coming. Holt watched her for a long moment. Voss, his voice carried down the line like a stone skipped across still water. You planning to shoot or take a nap? A few of the younger Marines shifted. 1 or 2 allowed themselves a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Maren Voss opened her eyes. She did not look at Holt. She looked downrange, into the shimmer of heat rising off the valley floor, and said nothing. That was how it had been since she arrived at Iron Hawk 3 weeks ago. Quiet, still, watchful in a way that made some of the men uncomfortable without being able to explain why. She had come with transfer orders from a unit whose designation was classified, and a service record that the base personnel officer had described, quietly, to Master Gunnery Sergeant Briggs as the kind of file you don't summarize out loud. None of that mattered to Holt. He had seen her record, the parts he was cleared to see, and found it thin on the kind of experience he respected. She had not served in a line unit. She had not deployed with a Raider battalion. In Holt's taxonomy of worth, those absences spoke louder than any redacted commendation. She was 28 years old. She was the only woman on his sniper team. And in 15 years of building some of the finest long-range shooters the Marine Corps had ever produced, Holt had never been more certain of anything than he was uncertain about her. He walked to the center of the line and raised his voice. Reset, all of you. Check your dope, check your atmospherics, and somebody tell me why we cannot hit a stationary target in conditions that are, according to every piece of equipment on this line, well within our capability. Lance Corporal Deacon Firth lowered his spotting scope and rubbed the back of his neck. He was 23 years old, raw-boned and quiet, raised in the hill country of eastern Kentucky, where his grandfather had taught him to read weather before he could read books. He had been watching the mirage boil between the firing line and the distant target all morning, and something about its behavior troubled him in a way he could not yet put into numbers. The heat shimmer was not moving in one direction. It was moving in 3. He almost said something. He caught the look on Holt's face and decided against it. Maren Voss had not reset. She was still lying on her mat, still looking downrange, but now her eyes were open and tracking slowly across the full length of the range, near to far, far to near, pausing at certain distances the way a person pauses on a word they are trying to remember. She was watching the grass on the berms, the direction flags, the way the dust moved at different distances. She was reading something the others were not reading. 20 minutes earlier, before the 9th shot, she had tried to say something about it. Gunny! Her voice had been level, professional. The mirage at mid-range is running counter to the flag at the target. There's a thermal off the rock formation at 1,000 yards that's creating a localized crosswind. If we're solving for the flag alone, we're Voss. Holt had not looked at her. We have kestrels for atmospheric data. We have ballistic solvers. We have equipment that costs more than your car and was designed by people with advanced degrees in applied physics. I appreciate the observation. He had not appreciated the observation. She had gone quiet. Not wounded quiet, not embarrassed quiet, the kind of quiet that absorbs something and files it away carefully, for later. She had gone back to her mat and lay down and closed her eyes. Now the morning was wearing on, and the steel target at 1,750 yards was still unmoved, and Holt was running out of things to blame. That was when the old man walked through the gate. He came from the direction of the maintenance road that ran along the eastern edge of the range. He was pushing a groundskeeper's cart, the kind used for hauling fertilizer in sprinkler heads and the small, irrelevant machinery of keeping a military installation's grass alive. He was dressed in worn, khaki work clothes, his boots dusty, a faded Marine Corps veteran's cap pulled low over a face that carried 82 years like weathered hardwood carries its rings, visible but earned. He walked with the unhurried, ground-covering stride of a man who has never needed to announce his arrival. Across one shoulder he carried something wrapped in an old canvas cloth, tied with cord. He stopped at the edge of the firing line. He did not ask permission to enter. He stood and looked downrange for a long moment, his pale gray eyes moving across the terrain in the same slow, methodical way that Maren Voss's eyes had been moving. He was reading the same thing she was reading. Maren noticed him before anyone else did. She turned her head slightly, and something shifted in her expression. Not recognition. Not quite. It was closer to the feeling of hearing a phrase in a foreign language you have studied privately, alone, from an old textbook, and realizing for the first time that someone else in the room speaks it too. She watched him read the range, and she was still watching when Holt turned and saw him. "Hey!" Holt's voice changed register, the sharp, territorial bark of a man whose space has been entered without invitation. He took 3 strides toward the old man. "This is a restricted live-fire range. Civilian access is prohibited. I need you to turn around and go back the way you came." The old man did not turn around. He looked at one of the wind flags near the midpoint of the range, the one that had been giving them contradictory readings all morning, and tilted his head slightly, as if the flag had just confirmed something he had already suspected. "Your computers can't see the thermal coming off that granite outcropping at 1,000 yards, he said. His voice was unhurried, a low, even rumble, the kind of voice that had given orders in places where speaking too loudly got people killed. "And the flag at your target is lying to you. The valley is channeling a reverse current on the near side of it. You're shooting through 3 different wind environments in solving for one." Holt stopped walking. The range was very quiet. "Who are you?" Holt said. The old man finally looked at him. His eyes were steady and without aggression, the eyes of someone who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything to anyone and found the freedom in that. "Ray Calloway," he said. "I maintain the grounds on the north side of the installation." "A groundskeeper." Holt said it the way a man might say the word when he is confirming something he finds absurd. "Among other things." Holt turned back to his team, letting his expression do the work. The slight widening of the eyes, the barely there smile that invited the younger Marines to share his assessment of the situation. A couple of them responded. Firth did not. Maren Voss did not. Maren Voss was watching Ray Calloway with an expression that Firth, who had positioned himself to see both of them, would later struggle to describe accurately. It was not admiration. It was not suspicion. It was the focused, searching attention of someone who has been trying to solve a problem alone for a very long time and is suddenly confronted with someone who is already holding the answer, turning it over quietly in their hands. She also noticed something else. Ray Calloway had set down the canvas-wrapped object while he talked to Holt, leaning it carefully against the cart. The cord had loosened, and the canvas had fallen open at one end, revealing the tip of a wooden stock. Dark walnut, almost black with age and oil. A bolt-action rifle. Old. Very old. But maintained with a kind of care that spoke of something more than mechanical function. The care given to things that carry meaning beyond their utility. And on the stock, just visible above where the canvas still covered it, the edge of a carved inscription. Iron Hawk. 2 words, the name of this range. Marin stared at those 2 words for a moment longer than made sense. Then she looked at Ray Calloway's hands. The way he held himself near the rifle, even while talking to Holt. The unconscious proximity of a man to something that has been part of him for decades. And something turned over quietly in the back of her mind. She had a memory, not a clear one. She had been 3 years old, maybe younger, standing somewhere she could not fully reconstruct, and a large, weathered hand had placed something cold and heavy into hers for just a moment, the weight of it enormous for a child's arms. And then the hand had taken it back. She had never known what the memory was connected to. Her grandmother had never explained it. She had carried it the way you carry things that have no context, as a texture rather than a fact. She looked at the inscription on the stock again. Holt was still talking. "I'm going to ask you one more time to vacate this installation," he was saying. "If you don't, I will contact the MPs and have you removed. And if that object you're carrying is a firearm, I will have it confiscated pending a safety review." "I suppose you could do better," Ray said, simply, evenly. Not a challenge, an observation, offered without heat. The range went still in a different way. Holt turned. His face had gone the careful, controlled blank of a man who is genuinely angry and has enough discipline not to show all of it. "Excuse me? You fired 9 shots this morning," Ray said. "I heard them from the maintenance road. All 9 missed. Your team has the equipment, they have the training, and they're failing because they're solving the wrong problem. I said I suppose you could do better. I meant it as a question. Something about the directness of it, the complete absence of malice or theater, made it worse for Holt than any open confrontation would have been. He pointed at the canvas-wrapped rifle. His voice was careful and precise in the way of a man measuring each word. "What is that thing?" Ray reached down and unwrapped it without ceremony. It was an M40, the original configuration built on a Remington 700 action, with a walnut stock that had gone nearly black over its decades of use. The scope mounted on top was simple and old. None of the illuminated reticles and turret dialing complexity of the modern optics on the line. The barrels showed the careful maintenance of decades, but also the honest wear of real use. This was not a display piece. This was not a collection item kept in a climate-controlled case. This rifle had been somewhere, had done something, and the doing had left its marks. One of the young Marines said, quietly and involuntarily, "Is that a Vietnam-era M40? The question landed on the range like a stone in still water, sending rings outward in every direction. Holt looked at the rifle. He looked at the old man holding it with the ease of a man holding his own hand. He allowed himself a short, disbelieving exhale through his nose. "You cannot be serious," he said. "The barrel on that is probably worn smooth. You're going to hurt yourself. That thing belongs in a museum." He shook his head, turning back to his team with the gesture of a man moving past something unworthy of further attention. "I'm calling the MPs. "Gunny," Firth's voice, quiet but clear. Holt turned. Firth was not looking at him. Firth was looking at Marin Voss, who had risen from her mat and was standing between Holt and the old man. Not aggressively, not with any overt statement of defiance, simply standing, her hands at her sides, her eyes on Holt. Her position making a declaration that her silence had been building toward since the moment the old man walked through the gate. "Stand down, Voss," Holt said. She did not move. The moment held. Around them, the wind moved across the range in its 3 different directions, indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath it. The steel target at 1,750 yards sat in the afternoon heat, patient and untouched, waiting for someone to finally ask it the right question. Firth turned quietly away from the firing line, pulled his phone from his pocket, and found the number he had been thinking about for the last 10 minutes. Master Gunnery Sergeant Briggs at the main armory, the oldest active Marine on the installation, the one the other old hands called when something happened that did not fit the normal categories of things. The phone rang twice. Armory, Briggs. Firth kept his voice low. Master Guns, it's Firth from Ironhawk. We have a situation out here. An old man, civilian, groundskeeper, walked onto the range with an M40. Gunny Holt is about to have him removed. A pause. He said his name is Ray Calloway. The silence on the other end lasted 6 full seconds. When Briggs spoke again, his voice had changed completely. The institutional gravel was still there, but underneath it, something had shifted. Something that sounded, in a man of Briggs's age and bearing, very much like urgency stripped of its usual disguise. Son, he said, listen to me carefully. Do not let Holt touch that man. Do whatever you have to do to slow this down. I'm making a call right now. The line went dead. Firth lowered the phone and looked back at the firing line. Marin Voss was still standing between Gunnery Sergeant Holt and the old man with the ancient rifle. Ray Calloway had not moved, had not shifted his weight, had not changed his expression. He was looking past Holt, past the firing line, past all of it, out toward the far end of the range where the steel target waited in the shimmering air. He was still reading the wind. And Firth, who had grown up in the Kentucky hills reading weather before he could read words, had the sudden, vertiginous sense that the old man already knew exactly where every current was running, had known since the moment he stepped through the gate, and that he had been waiting, quietly and without urgency, for the rest of them to catch up to what he already understood. Somewhere in the distance, the first sound of a vehicle engine carried across the scrub hills. Then another, then the distant wail of a siren, growing closer with a speed that meant someone had made a phone call, and the phone call had changed the priority of everything else on the installation. The vehicles came fast, not the measured, purposeful pace of a routine base patrol. Fast, the kind of fast that meant words had been said on a phone that rearranged the hierarchy of the afternoon. 2 black command Humvees and a military police cruiser materialized out of the dust on the access road, their light bars turning silently in the afternoon glare, and they did not slow until they were 20 yards from the firing line. Doors opened before the vehicles had fully stopped. The first man out was Colonel Garrett Draper, commanding officer of the Marine Raider Training Center. His uniform was immaculate in the way that senior officers' uniforms are always immaculate, pressed to a geometry that seemed to resist the heat and dust that softened everything else on the range. His face was not immaculate. His face was the controlled, purposeful intensity of a man moving towards something important, and he was moving at a pace that made the 2 officers behind him work to keep up. Behind Draper came the base sergeant major, a man built like a piling driven deep into hard ground, whose expression suggested he had seen most things the Corps could produce and remained largely unimpressed by them. Behind the sergeant major came a third man, 1 star on his collar. Brigadier General Avery Hicks had been on Camp Pendleton for 6 hours, conducting a scheduled review of the Raider Training Center's curriculum pipeline. He was not supposed to be at Ironhawk Range. He was supposed to be in a conference room with a legal pad and a cup of cooling coffee, reviewing performance metrics and quarterly budget allocations. Exactly the kind of work that Hicks, who had spent 22 years as an operational officer before pinning his star, found quietly suffocating. When Draper's call came through, Hicks had set down the coffee and followed without asking for details. The convoy stopped. The dust settled. Holt had been in the Corps for 15 years. He had served in 2 combat deployments. He had trained under some of the finest senior NCOs the institution had ever produced. And he had never, in 15 years, seen a full colonel and a one-star general arrive at a firing range with lights running at this speed. He stood very still. The certainty that had filled him all morning had begun, at its edges, to develop the texture of something else entirely. Colonel Draper ignored him completely. He walked directly to Ray Calloway, not at a measured command pace, but with the slightly urgent stride of a man closing a distance he feels he should never have allowed to open in the first place. He stopped 2 feet in front of the old groundskeeper, and without ceremony, without preamble, without any of the theatrical buildup that moments like this sometimes attract, he brought his right hand up in the sharpest salute Holt had ever witnessed from an officer of that rank. The range was absolutely silent. Draper held the salute until Ray gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then the colonel lowered his hand and turned and looked at Holt with an expression that Holt would carry with him for the rest of his career. Not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. "Sir," Draper said to Ray, without taking his eyes off Holt, "I apologize for what happened here today." Ray said nothing. He shifted the M40 slightly in his hands, comfortable and entirely unhurried. Draper turned to face the line of snipers, who had come to attention with the automatic precision of men who understand when the gravitational field of a situation has fundamentally and irrevocably changed. "At ease," Draper said. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. "In a moment, I'm going to introduce you to the man some of you just watched your gunnery sergeant attempt to remove from this range." He let that land fully before continuing. "But first," he turned, "Sergeant Voss." Marin, who had stepped back from between the 2 men when the convoy arrived, came to attention. "At ease, Sergeant." Draper looked at her with a steadiness that carried more weight than his words were yet carrying. "Do you know who this man is?" Marin looked at Ray Calloway. The old man was watching her with an expression she could not fully read. Patient, intent, the way a person looks at something they have been expecting for a very long time and are now confirming with their own eyes. "No, sir," she said. Draper held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "He knew your mother." The words arrived quietly. They did not shout. They did not announce themselves with any of the drama the moment might have warranted. They simply entered the air and changed the composition of everything around them, the way a single degree of temperature change can alter the entire behavior of the wind. Marin's face did not move, but something behind it did. A shift so interior that only someone watching with absolute attention would have caught it. Firth caught it. Ray Calloway, who had not looked away from her since the convoy arrived, caught it too. "Sir," Draper continued, turning back to address the full line, "allow me to introduce Chief Warrant Officer 5 Ray Calloway, United States Marine Corps, retired." He paused to let the rank register. CWO5, the highest warrant officer grade in the Corps, reached by fewer than a handful of men in any generation. Mr. Calloway holds the 3rd longest confirmed precision engagement in Marine Corps history, a shot made under field conditions that your ballistic computers would have flagged as non-viable before the round left the barrel. Another pause. He is the primary author of the USMC Scout Sniper Employment Manual, 1st edition, 1977. The manual that forms the doctrinal foundation of every sniper course this institution has run for the last 47 years. One of the young Marines exhaled audibly. "In 30 years of active instruction," Draper continued, "he trained more than 200 designated marksmen and scout snipers, a significant number of whom went on to become instructors themselves. When he retired, he was offered a position on the curriculum board at Quantico." Draper let a beat of silence pass. He declined. He asked instead to be considered for a grounds maintenance position here at Camp Pendleton. The colonel's voice carried something in it now. Not quite bewilderment, not quite admiration, but the space between the two where something genuinely rare lives. "He has been maintaining the north grounds of this installation, including the perimeter of this range, for 11 years. Holt stood with the rigid posture of a man holding himself together through discipline alone. because discipline was the only thing left. General Hicks, who had been standing slightly apart from the group, with the quiet attention of a man accustomed to evaluating situations rather than performing in them, stepped forward now. He looked at Ray Calloway with an expression of genuine, uncomplicated respect, the kind that does not require an audience. "Ray," he said, "not Mr. Calloway, not Chief Warrant Officer, Ray." The familiarity of two men who had crossed paths at various points in the long institutional history of the Corps, and each time come away knowing the other better than before. "It's been a long time," Ray looked at him. Something moved briefly in the pale gray eyes, a flicker of recognition, warm but contained, the way a banked fire responds to air. "General." Draper turned back to the team. "Mr. Calloway came to this range this morning because he heard 9 shots miss a stationary target. He came because that is what he has always done. He pays attention, and when he hears something wrong, he moves toward it rather than away from it." The colonel's voice had not risen, but its weight had increased with every sentence until it was pressing on everyone present. "Your gunnery sergeant chose to treat him as a trespasser. Your gunnery sergeant chose to mock his equipment and his age and his presence on this range, in front of his Marines, rather than ask a single question of a man who had already demonstrated in one sentence that he understood your problem better than you did." He turned to Holt. His voice dropped to a register that was somehow more severe for its quietness. "Gunnery Sergeant Holt, you had a living document of this institution standing 3 feet in front of you, and you aimed your contempt at him. That is a failure of judgment. It is a failure of leadership, and it is a failure of the basic professional curiosity that separates a craftsman from a technician." Holt's face was stone. "Sir, no excuse, sir." "No," Draper agreed. "There isn't one." He turned back to Ray, and his voice changed, the command register falling away, replaced by something more direct and human. "Mr. Calloway, would you be willing to show these men what they have been missing?" Ray looked at the line of young snipers for a moment. He looked at Marin Voss, who was watching him with the same focused, searching attention she had fixed on him from the moment he walked through the gate. Then he looked downrange at the steel silhouette sitting motionless at 1,750 yards in the afternoon heat. He set the M40 down, not at the empty firing position at the end of the line. He carried it to the mat where Marin had been lying all morning, and he set it down in front of her. The range went quiet in a new way. Not the silence of tension or confrontation, but the silence of a moment that understands its own significance. "Your mother made this rifle sing," Ray said. His voice was low, meant for her, but the quality of the silence around them carried it to everyone present. "I've been keeping it here for 30 years, waiting for someone who could do the same." Marin looked at the rifle, the dark walnut stock, the simple old scope, the honest, total wear of something that had been used for its intended purpose across decades without apology. She looked at the inscription on the stock, the one she had been returning to since the canvas fell open. "Iron Hawk, DV, 1988, Dana Voss." Her mother had held this rifle on this range 36 years ago, had pressed her cheek against the same stock on this same ground, and looked through the same glass at a world that required patience and attention, and the willingness to be wrong about what you thought you knew. Ray crouched down beside her, his joints registering the movement with quiet complaint that he ignored, and he began to speak in the unhurried way of a man who has explained things to people his whole life and long ago stopped needing them to respond on any particular schedule. "The first thing you do," he said, "is forget the flag at the target. It is the last element in the sequence, and right now it is lying to you. Look at the shimmer over the rock formation at 1,000 yards. See the way it's running right to left, against everything else on this range. That is a thermal. The sun has been heating that granite since 7 this morning, and it is putting a cross current into the air column that your kestrel cannot measure, because your kestrel is sitting here on this mat, not out there in that air. Marin was looking where he pointed. Firth had moved to where he could look too, his spotting scope raised without his fully deciding to raise it. At 1,500 yards, Ray continued, see the grass on that berm? It is barely moving. And what little movement there is, look at the direction. It is leaning toward you. The wind is rolling back on itself there. There is a fold in the terrain just behind that berm, shallow, maybe 4 feet deep, and it is creating a reversal. Your bullet will enter that reversal at roughly 1.3 seconds into its flight. Your computer does not know the fold is there. It has never walked this range. Marin's eyes moved across the terrain with the same slow methodology Ray had used when he first arrived. Near to far, pausing, reading, confirming. The flag at the target is catching the main valley current, Ray said. Left to right, consistent, measurable. Your computers see that current, and they give you a solution based on it. But your bullet does not fly through that current alone. It flies through all 3 environments in sequence. You have to find the window, the moment in the solution where all 3 environments are close enough to a single answer that you can thread them together. He looked at her directly. You already know this. You tried to say it this morning. She had, and had been interrupted before she could finish the sentence. The thermal at 1,000 runs for approximately 40 yards before it dissipates. The reversal at 1,500 is narrower, 20 yards, perhaps less. The main current at the target is consistent and will do what the flag says it will do. You weight your solution toward the near and mid environments because that is where the deviation originates. Let the main current carry the rest. He paused. 2 clicks right, 3 minutes of elevation for the density altitude this afternoon, no more than that. Marin looked at the scope's adjustment knobs. She made the clicks. Small, deliberate, certain. The adjustments of someone who has been given the final piece of a calculation they had already begun. She lay down behind the rifle. The walnut stock was cool against her cheek despite the afternoon heat. The density of old wood holding its temperature the way stone holds it, slowly and completely. The smell reached her immediately. Linseed oil, something older underneath it, something with no name that struck her, without logic and without warning, as profoundly familiar. Not remembered, deeper than remembered. The recognition of something that preceded conscious memory, that lived in the body rather than the mind. She found the target in the scope. Ray sat back on his heels beside her and said nothing more. He had given her what she needed. The rest was entirely hers. The range was completely still. Draper stood with his hands clasped behind his back. Hicks watched without expression. The young Marines had stopped being an audience and become something closer to witnesses, people present at something they had not expected and would not forget. Holt stood at the end of the line and did not move. Firth had his spotting scope on the target and his breath held. Marin breathed in slowly, let half of it out, found the still point in her own chest, where everything quieted to its essential nature. She tracked the thermo at the near distance, felt its movement translated through the glass into information her body processed before her mind could articulate it. She registered the reversal at mid-range as a thing to account for and release. She let the main current at the target become background rather than primary data. She found the window. She squeezed the trigger. The M40 spoke in the voice of another era, sharp, clean, without the mechanical modernity of the rifles on either side of her. The sound went out across the range and the hills took it and held it for a moment and then released it. 2.5 seconds. The silence stretched across 1,750 yards of complicated California air. And then, distant but absolute and unmistakable, the sound that every person on that firing line had been chasing since first light. The clear, ringing metallic report of a copper-jacketed bullet striking hardened steel at its center, traveling back across the distance to confirm what had just happened. The reaction moved down the line like a current finding its ground. Several of the younger Marines made sounds that training had not fully disciplined out of them. Firth lowered his spotting scope and looked at the mat where Marin lay, and his expression was the open, uncomplicated expression of someone who has just watched something they will still be able to describe clearly 40 years from now. Draper did not cheer. He pressed his lips together and nodded once, slowly, with the deliberate economy of a man who has learned to acknowledge significant things without diminishing them through excess. General Hicks said nothing at all. He looked at Ray Calloway with an expression that contained, in its compressed and weathered way, everything that needed to be said between two men who understood what they had just witnessed. Marin did not move immediately. She lay behind the rifle with her cheek still against the stock, her eyes still open, looking downrange at the target she could no longer see clearly through the scope, but knew with certainty was there. Her right hand rested near the trigger guard, fully relaxed now. Her breathing was even. Firth was close enough to see that her shoulders were not entirely still. She pushed herself up from the mat after a long moment, unhurried, and stood. She did not look at Holt. She looked at Ray, who was still crouching beside where she had been lying, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The particular silence of two people who have just completed something together and are still inside its weight. Then Ray reached down and picked up the M40 from the mat, and he turned it in his hands and looked at the inscription on the stock for a long moment, his thumb moving across the carved letters with the ease of a man who has made that same small gesture more times than he could count. He held it out to her. She did not take it immediately. She looked at it, at the dark walnut and the honest wear, at the name carved into the wood, her mother's initials, her mother's year, this range, this ground, this exact place in the California hills where something had been waiting for 30 years for its intended recipient to arrive. And then she took it. The weight of it settled into her hands the way weight settles when it belongs there, as if the rifle had simply been waiting to find its balance. Ray straightened up. His joints made their quiet complaint, and he ignored it completely. Draper had turned to Holt. His voice was not raised. It had the quality of something being entered into a permanent record, which in the institutional life of the Marine Corps, it effectively was. Gunnery Sergeant Holt, your team will report for 1 week of remedial instruction beginning Monday at 0600. The curriculum will cover atmospheric reading, mirage interpretation, and fieldcraft fundamentals, specifically the fieldcraft that your equipment was designed to support, not to replace. He paused with precision. Mr. Calloway will serve as primary instructor. Sergeant Voss will co-instruct. The last sentence landed in the air and stayed there. Holt's face moved through something complicated and arrived at the only destination available to it. Sir. Yes, sir. Draper held his gaze for a moment, then stepped back. The formal part of it was complete. What remained was the human part, which is almost always harder and almost always more important. Ray walked to Holt, not quickly, not with any performance of confrontation or correction. He walked to him the way a man walks to close a door that someone else left open, not in anger, but because the door needs to be closed. He stopped in front of the younger Marine, who was taller by 3 inches and younger by 44 years, and who had the particular stillness of a man who has been accurately assessed in a public place and has nothing remaining to defend. Ray placed a hand on his shoulder, not heavily, just the weight of a hand, offered without ceremony. The gear helps, he said. His voice held no trace of victory, no satisfaction at correction, none of the residue of the morning's confrontation. I'm not telling you to leave it on the shelf. I'm telling you it is a tool, and a tool describes what it measures. It cannot describe what it cannot reach. The wind at this range runs in 3 layers. Your Kestrel reads 1. The other 2 require something the Kestrel was never built to have. He tapped his own temple once with a weathered finger. Years of looking, and the willingness to be wrong about what you thought you already knew. Holt met his eyes. The quality of the eye contact had changed entirely from what it had been an hour before. The aggressive, territorial certainty was entirely gone, and what had replaced it was the slightly raw, exposed look of a man whose floor has been removed, and who is discovering that standing without it is something he can, in fact, do. "Sir," Holt said. "Understood." Ray nodded once and dropped his hand and turned away. Firth had drifted during this exchange, a habit of the observant man who makes himself peripheral in charged moments in order to see them more completely. He had moved to where Ray's groundskeeper cart sat at the edge of the range, and something on the side of it caught his eye. Small, almost invisible in its placement, a sticker half dissolved by years of California sun and morning dew. The kind of small personal marker that maintenance staff sometimes put on their equipment carts to distinguish their own from the others. He leaned closer. It was not a decorative sticker. It was a unit patch, faded past most of its color, but not past its shape. Firth, who had spent 2 years working out of the armory, listening to Briggs reconstruct the institutional history of the Corps, recognized the outline immediately. 1st Marine Division, Scout Sniper Platoon, a patch that had not been issued in that configuration since 1983. He straightened up and looked at Ray Calloway, who was 20 feet away, standing beside Marin. The old man was nodding slowly at something she had said in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. His expression was not the expression of an instructor evaluating a student's performance. It was something older and less formal than that. The expression of someone recognizing something they had lost a long time ago and have found again in a place they did not entirely expect. Firth thought about the inscription on the stock. Iron Hawk, DV 1988. He thought about what Draper had said, that Ray had trained Dana Voss, the only female student in 30 years of instruction. He thought about Marin Voss arriving at this range 3 weeks ago with a classified service record and a way of reading the wind that she had apparently developed on her own, from what she had mentioned to him once, briefly and without elaboration, as a notebook her grandmother had given her. He thought about the fact that Ray Calloway had been maintaining the grounds of this installation for 11 years, had been walking the perimeter of this range through more training cycles and sniper evaluations than anyone had formally counted, had been here when Marin Voss arrived 3 weeks ago, had let 3 weeks pass before walking through the gate. Something about that specific interval, 3 weeks, not 3 days, not 3 months, felt less like coincidence and more like the measured patience of a man who watches until he is certain and only moves when the certainty is complete. Firth put it away in the part of his mind where he kept things that were not yet fully formed and went back to the line to help break down the equipment for the day. The afternoon light had shifted during all of it. The range had taken on that specific quality of late California afternoon, gold and lateral, the kind of light that makes the scrub hills look like something from a painting of the American West, rather than an active military installation. The steel target at 1,750 yards caught that light differently than it had all morning, and the difference was the small, clean mark at its center that had not been there before. Marin Voss was standing near the gate through which Ray had entered, the M40 held at her side, looking down the full length of the range. She was reading it the way she had been reading it all morning, with full attention, without instruments, attending to what was actually present rather than what she expected to find. After a long moment, she looked down at the rifle in her hands. Her thumb moved across the inscription on the stock. Iron Hawk, DV 1988. She held it for a long time. The gold light moved across the walnut and made it look like something that had always been exactly where it was, belonging entirely to its moment and to the complicated thread of things that pass between people across the distances of years and decades, and the specific silences that accumulate between them. Behind her, she heard Ray Calloway's boots on the gravel as he collected his cart. She turned. "Mr. Calloway," she said. He stopped. She looked at him with the same direct, full attention she gave the range, without deflection, without the social softening that most people apply to difficult moments. Monday, she said, 0600. Ray looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression moved through several things in quick succession and arrived at something simple and settled, like a wind finding its single true direction after a day of confusion. I know the way, he said. He picked up the handles of his cart and turned toward the maintenance road, his boots raising small, quiet puffs of dust with each step. The late afternoon light falling across his back and the worn khaki of his work clothes, growing smaller against the scrub hills with the particular diminishment of someone who has done what they came to do and requires nothing further from the moment. Marin watched him go. In her hands, the M40 was warm now from the sun and from holding. The weight of it had stopped feeling like something she was carrying and started feeling like something she was simply part of, continuous with her own arms and hands, and the particular quality of attention that had brought her to this range, to this mat, to this afternoon, to the small, clean mark at the center of a steel target 1,750 yards away. The wind came off the hills in a single direction finally, as it sometimes did in the late afternoon when the thermals settled and the valley found its natural current. She read it without thinking about it. She already knew which way it was running. The week began before the sun did. Monday morning at Iron Hawk Range, the marine layer was still thick off the Pacific. The kind of low coastal fog that turns Camp Pendleton into something gray and muffled and stripped of its usual hard military edges. The hills were invisible. The target at 1,750 yards was invisible. The range itself was little more than a long rectangle of suggestion in the pre-dawn dark, defined by the dim shapes of the berms and the faint outline of the firing line emerging slowly from the gray. Marin Voss arrived at 0540. She had not slept particularly well, but she had slept, which was more than she had expected. She set up the equipment methodically in the dark, working by feel and by the kind of spatial memory that develops in people who have spent time in places where light is not available, and the work still has to be done. She laid out 2 shooting mats. She positioned the spotting equipment. She set out the simple materials Ray had specified when Draper's aide called him Friday afternoon to confirm the week's arrangement. No kestrels, no ballistic computers, no laser rangefinders, grass clippings in small bundles, a set of surveying flags on thin wire stakes, a notebook and pencils, a hand level, a simple analog barometer of the kind that had not been standard military issue since before most of the team was born. She looked at the assembled materials in the early dark and felt something she had not expected. Not the performance anxiety of a co-instructor facing her first formal session, but something quieter and more settled. The particular stillness of standing at the beginning of something that has been a long time arriving and is now, finally, here. The team arrived at 0555. 7 Marines, including Holt, who came last and said nothing when he arrived and took the position at the end of the line that he had occupied all the previous week. The position that had, until Friday afternoon, been the position of unquestioned authority. It was no longer that. It was simply a place on the line where a Marine stood, the same as any other place. Ray Calloway arrived at 0600 exactly. He came on foot from the maintenance road, without the cart, carrying only a canvas shoulder bag and the M40 in its cloth wrap. He moved like a man who knew exactly where he was going and had decided some time ago that arriving was less important than the quality of attention given to the journey between here and there. He set the shoulder bag down at the head of the line and looked at the assembled team without ceremony. "Good morning," he said, not with the parade ground projection that Holt used when addressing the team, just the ordinary register of a man speaking to people he is standing near. "We're going to begin this week by doing nothing." A beat of silence moved down the line. "For the first 30 minutes, I want each of you to lie on your mat, put your eye to your scope, and look at the range. Don't adjust anything. Don't take any readings. Don't reach for any equipment at all. Look at the range and tell me what you see." He paused, Not what your instruments tell you, what you see with your own eyes. Holt went to his mat without a word. The team settled into position. Marin lay down behind the spotting scope, not her own rifle, and watched the range come up slowly in the growing light as the marine layer began its gradual, reluctant withdrawal from the hills. She had been doing this, in some form, for most of her life. The notebook her grandmother had given her, a composition book, black and white cover, its spine repaired multiple times with electrical tape, had been in Marin's possession since she was 9 years old. Her grandmother had presented it without explanation, the way certain things move through families, carried by the gravity of their importance and the silence of things not yet ready to be spoken. Inside the front cover, in handwriting that Marin had recognized immediately as her mother's, were 4 words written in pencil, pressed firmly into the paper. Learn to see first. The rest of the notebook was filled with dense, careful notation. Wind observation logs recorded across months and seasons. Atmospheric sketches with arrows indicating direction and force. Long, patient descriptions of how mirage behaved at different temperature differentials. Written not with technical formality, but with the precise observational language of someone who had spent an enormous amount of time watching something and had found, slowly, the words to describe exactly what she saw. There were hand-drawn diagrams. There were shooting solutions worked entirely without computational aid, with marginal notes recording where the solution had been confirmed and where it had failed, and more importantly, what the failure had taught. Marin had taught herself to shoot largely from that notebook. She had always assumed it encoded her mother's own system, developed independently through years of practice. She had not known, until Friday afternoon on Iron Hawk Range, that the methodology had a source older than her mother, that it had been given before it had been developed, that her mother had received it here on this range from the same man who was now walking slowly behind the line, asking a question none of them had been asked before. She watched the range come up in the early light and understood, in a way she had not fully understood before Friday, that she was not a self-taught shooter. She was the third iteration of something Ray Calloway had begun 4 decades ago. A line of attention and discipline and the particular willingness to look at what was actually there that had passed through her mother and arrived at her through a composition book with a repaired spine and 4 words written inside the cover. At 0630, Ray walked slowly behind the line, stopping behind each Marine in turn and asking them a single, quiet question. Not, what does your equipment read? What do you see? The answers were, at first, thin, wind left to right at the target, thermal activity at mid-range, flags showing consistent drift. The vocabulary of instruments rather than eyes, offered by habit rather than observation. Ray listened to each answer without criticism or correction. When he reached Firth, who had been watching the range with the particular patience of someone raised in country where weather was not an abstraction, but a daily negotiation, the answer was longer and more layered, and Ray stood behind him for an extra moment in silence. When he reached Marin, she described what she saw in the same terms she had used the previous Friday before Holt cut her off. The 3-layer structure, the thermal at the near distance, the reversal at mid-range, the main current at the target, and added what the morning's specific conditions had introduced. The way the marine layer's slow retreat was warming the near-distance thermal, changing its character from what it had been at first light. Ray listened to all of it. What else? He said. She looked longer. Let the range tell her what it was still holding back. There's a 4th element, she said. Low, near the ground between 500 and 700 yards. The retreating fog is creating a surface inversion. It's been consistent for the last 20 minutes, but it will dissipate when the sun clears the eastern hill. Maybe another 35 minutes. After that, the inversion breaks, and the whole near-distance picture changes. Ray was quiet for a moment that had weight in it. Your mother used to see that layer, he said. Most people look for the obvious movements and stop looking when they find them. She never stopped. He moved on down the line. Marin held what he had said the way you hold something fragile while you decide where to set it down without breaking it. And then she went back to the scope and kept looking. The week built on itself the way genuine learning does, not in dramatic revelations, but in the slow, cumulative way that a picture develops from vague shapes into something that cannot be unseen, cannot be returned to uncertainty. Each morning, the 30 minutes of silent observation. Each morning, Ray's question moving down the line, and each morning the answers, slightly less thin, slightly more layered, as 7 Marines began the slow work of retraining their attention away from the instruments and toward the range itself. He taught them to read mirage with the precision of a language, the way the character of the boil indicated temperature differential, the way the angle of shimmer indicated wind velocity more honestly than any flag, the way different textures of heat distortion corresponded to different atmospheric conditions at different distances. He drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick and erased them with his boot and drew them again from a different angle. He used the grass clippings and the wire stake flags to demonstrate how airflow behaved over varied terrain with the patience of a man who understands that the body needs to see a thing many times before the mind will retain it. He sat cross-legged on the ground in front of the team, like a man who had long ago stopped needing the authority of standing to command attention. Holt said almost nothing for the first 3 days. He lay on his mat every morning and looked at the range and answered Ray's question when asked, and executed his work with the tight, contained focus of a man who has made a genuine decision to be present to something difficult. The aggression was entirely gone. So was the easy command confidence that had always read, in retrospect, as certainty about things that had not been earned. What remained was something rawer, and in its rawness, more honest. A man stripped of his usual instruments, looking at a landscape he thought he knew, and finding it more complicated and more interesting than he had allowed. On Wednesday afternoon, Ray asked the team to shoot without any ballistic solution at all. No computer, no manual calculation, no kestrel reading. Look at the range, read what you see, make your adjustments from observation alone, and fire. 3 of the 7 Marines hit the target on the first shot. Firth hit it cleanly. A young staff sergeant with 8 years in hit it. Marin hit it, moving through the same 3-layer reading she had described on Monday morning, with adjustments so small and precise that Firth, spotting for her, barely registered her hands moving on the knobs before the shot went. Holt missed. He lay behind his rifle for a long moment after the shot, not moving, not adjusting, in the specific stillness of a man sitting with something he cannot argue his way around. Then he made an adjustment, re-engaged the target, and fired again. He hit it. Ray said nothing about the miss. He said nothing about the hit. He moved on, unhurried, as if both were simply part of the same process, which they were. That evening, after the rest of the team had cleared the range, and the California afternoon was going gold and long across the hills, Marin stayed. She was breaking down the spotting equipment more slowly than necessary, the way people extend small tasks when they are waiting for the right moment to present itself. Ray was at the far end of the range, checking the placement of the observation flags he had set that morning, confirming what the day's shooting had confirmed or complicated. When he came back up the line, she was there. She set down the equipment she had been handling and looked at him with a direct, undeflected attention that was, by now, simply the way she looked at everything. "Why did you keep her rifle here?" she said. The inflection was too flat and too direct for a question. It was the statement of someone working through something out loud and requiring the other person to remain present while they do it. "You could have given it to her family. You could have given it to me years ago. You kept it here on this range for 30 years. Ray set down his bag with the unhurried precision of a man who is not deciding whether to answer, but choosing where to begin. "Your mother earned that rifle on this range in 1988, he said. "She was the finest student I taught in 30 years of instruction. Not the most technically gifted. I had others who moved through the mechanics faster, who hit the numbers with less effort, but the finest in the sense that actually matters. She saw the world the way it actually was, not the way she expected it to be. You either have that quality or you spend your whole career trying to compensate for not having it. He looked at the M40, leaning against the spotting stand near Marin's hand. When she was killed at Fort Bragg in 1994, I was notified through official channels. I came to this range the next morning and I picked up that rifle and I thought about sending it to her family. He paused. I had met her husband once at a family day. He was a good man. He was not a man who would have understood what to do with it. He would have stored it out of sight or mounted it on a wall. And both of those things would have been exactly wrong. Marin was watching him with complete stillness. In 1999, Ray continued, he brought his daughter to the installation for a base family day. You were 3 years old. He found me on the grounds near the armory. He had read about me in your mother's letters, and he wanted you to meet the person she had trained under. Ray was quiet for a moment that carried the weight of what came next. He set you down on the grass, and you walked directly to the maintenance shed where I stored the rifle, and you stood at the door and looked at it. 3 years old. You had no way of knowing what it was or why it was there. But you stood at that door for 5 full minutes while your father tried to redirect you, and you did not move. Marin's breathing had changed. Slightly, almost imperceptibly, but changed. I took the rifle out and held it in front of you. You reached for it. I let you hold it for 1 moment, 1 or 2 seconds, not more, and then I took it back. Your father was embarrassed. He apologized for you. Ray looked at her steadily, the pale gray eyes holding hers, with the calm certainty of a man delivering something he has been carrying for a long time. I told him not to apologize. I told him to remember that day, and that if his daughter ever ended up at this installation, to make sure she found her way to Iron Hawk Range. His voice held its even, unhurried character. He said he didn't understand why. I told him she would, when she arrived. Marin stood very still. He died in 2003, she said. Her voice was level. I know, Ray said. I found out through a contact at Quantico the following year. After that, I had no way of knowing what had become of you. I kept the rifle because there was no right person to give it to yet, and because some things should not be distributed before they reach their completion. She looked at the rifle in the last California afternoon light, the walnut stock, the simple scope, the inscription that had been waiting 36 years to be read by the right set of eyes. When did you know it was me? She said. When I arrived 3 weeks ago. Ray shook his head once. I knew your name was on the transfer orders 6 weeks before you arrived. A contact in personnel administration, someone I have known for a long time. He said it without apology or self-consciousness. The matter-of-fact statement of a man who has maintained institutional relationships across decades because the institutional memory those relationships carry is worth maintaining. I watched you from the maintenance road for 3 weeks after you arrived. Every morning before the rest of the team came to the range, you were already here, standing at the fence on the north perimeter, looking out over the range. No instruments, no data, just looking and reading what was there. He paused. Your mother stood at that same stretch of fence in 1983 when she first arrived here and was learning this range for the first time. Same posture, same quality of attention, the same particular stillness. He picked up his bag from the ground. When I saw you do it the first morning, I went back to the maintenance shed and I sat with the rifle for a while. I needed to be certain. Marin looked at him. Certain of what? That your readiness was real and not just your skill, he said. Those are different things. A person can have every technical capacity required and still not be ready to receive something. Readiness is knowing what a thing costs and being willing to pay it. He looked at her directly. You were ready. I waited 3 weeks to be sure of it. All week she had maintained the careful composure that 8 years of military service had constructed in her as a matter of professional necessity. The composure that had not broken on Friday afternoon when Draper said, he knew your mother. that had held when she lay behind her mother's rifle and made the shot, that had remained intact through the revelation of the inscription and the weight of the rifle finding its balance in her hands. It broke now. Not loudly, not with the dramatic release of someone who has been holding something enormous against its natural weight. Quietly, in the way that things break when the person holding them has been very strong for a very long time, and the moment of release arrives in a private place without an audience. Her eyes filled, and the quality of the light in them shifted, and she looked at the rifle, and then at the hills beyond the range end, and did not try to stop what was happening or redirect it into something more manageable. Ray did not move toward her. He did not offer comfort in the active, intervening sense that most people reach for when someone near them is moved. He simply stayed where he was, present and completely still, which was the right thing to do. The thing that someone who has attended people through their difficult moments for a very long time understands is often more useful than anything that can be said or physically offered. After a while, she looked back at him. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady again, returned to itself. "For keeping it, for waiting." Ray nodded once. That was sufficient. She picked up the M40 and held it with the same ease she had held it since Friday. Not as equipment, not as a symbolic object, but as something continuous with her own hands, and the particular quality of attention that had been moving through 3 people and 40 years toward this specific afternoon on this specific range. "Monday," she said, 05:30. "I know," Ray said. He picked up the handles of the empty cart. "So will I." The following Friday, the final day of the remedial week, Firth found himself alone on the range for 20 minutes after the rest of the team had packed out. He had stayed to collect the wire stake observation flags Ray had used throughout the week for wind mapping exercises. He went down the line, pulling them one by one from the ground. And when he reached the last flag, the one positioned at the 700-yard mark, closest to where the surface inversion had held on Monday morning, he stopped. He stood with the flag in his hand and looked downrange at the steel target that had been impossible on Thursday of the previous week, and was now something his body understood how to engage. Then he looked at the flag itself, a simple wire stake with a small square of orange surveying tape at the top, 30 cents of hardware that had taught him more about reading air than 3 years of instrument training. He put it in his pocket instead of the collection bag. He was not entirely sure why. He thought he might figure it out later. He thought it had something to do with the difference between measuring a thing and understanding it, and with the specific value of knowing, at any given moment, which of the two you were actually doing. He thought it had something to do with Ray Calloway and a composition book with a repaired spine and a rifle that had been kept on a range for 30 years against the arrival of the right person. He picked up the bag and walked off the range. He was already looking forward to Monday. The hardware store on the south end of Oceanside had survived the arrival of the large chain stores through the particular stubbornness of having been there first, and knowing where everything was and maintaining, through decades of small accumulated service, the trust of the people who lived within driving distance of it. On a Saturday afternoon in late September, it was quiet, populated by the unhurried weekend traffic of people with projects and no particular urgency driving them. Holt was in the wrong aisle. He had come for deck screws and had taken a wrong turn somewhere in the organized disorder of the store, which was the kind of small domestic navigation failure that had been carrying lately a disproportionate amount of metaphorical weight. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a plain gray shirt, the deliberate plainness of a man who spends enough of his professional life in uniform to value its absence. He found the right aisle. He was reading the label on a bag of lawn fertilizer when he heard footsteps he recognized before he looked up. The particular unhurried, ground-covering stride of a man for whom movement has never been wasted. Ray Calloway was in the adjacent aisle, studying a rack of seed packets with the focused, methodical attention he brought to everything he examined. He looked precisely as he looked on the range, present, deliberate, entirely himself, unaffected by the change of setting. Holt set down the fertilizer. He stood for a moment in the middle of the aisle, alone with the decision and its implications. Then he walked around the end of the rack. "Mr. Calloway," he said. Ray looked up from the seed packets. His expression was the same open, unguarded expression he wore when nothing was being performed, when there was no range, no team, no instruction in progress. Just a man looking at seeds on a Saturday afternoon with the same quality of attention he gave everything else. "Gunnery Sergeant," he said, simply, the acknowledgement of one person recognizing another, without the weight of the previous week pressed into it. Holt gestured at the packet Ray was holding. "Beefsteak or early girl?" Ray looked at the packet in his hand. "Mortgage lifter, old variety, takes considerably longer than the modern hybrids, but they're worth the patience." Holt nodded. A beat of silence passed between them, the comfortable kind that exists between people who no longer need to fill silence with sound. "Sir," Holt said, "I wanted to say something." He stopped, started again with the particular directness of a man who does not find this kind of speech natural and does not intend to pretend otherwise. "What you did this week, what you taught us," he shook his head slightly, the gesture of someone who has arrived at the border of available language. "I've been in the Corps 15 years. I've trained under some very good people." He looked at Ray with the plain directness that was, Marin had observed early in the week, the best thing about him when it was pointed in a useful direction. "I learned more this week than in the last 5 years of my career combined. And I don't mean the wind reading, though that too. I mean—" He stopped. "I know what you mean," Ray said. Holt held his gaze for a moment. Then he exhaled, and the last of something that had been held carefully in him since the previous Friday went with the exhale, quietly and without ceremony. "I treated you badly," he said. "I treated Sergeant Voss badly. I had reasons that felt like legitimate reasons at the time." "Most poor judgments do," Ray said, not harshly. Simply, the observation of a man who has watched human behavior across a long span and found it consistently and forgivably explicable. "No excuse for it." "No," Ray agreed, "but there is a useful difference between no excuse and no remedy. You cannot undo what was done. You can decide with clarity what comes after it." Holt looked at him. "Is that what you told her, Sergeant Voss?" Ray considered this with the brief, genuine attention he gave all questions before answering them. "I told her something that applied to her situation. What I'm telling you is what applies to yours. She doesn't need the same guidance." He looked at the seed packet in his hand. "She already knows what comes next." A moment of quiet settled between them. "Why did you come back, sir?" Holt said. The question was genuine and without any remaining edge in it. "After all this time, 11 years on the grounds crew, and you never walked through that gate once." Ray turned the seed packet over in his hands and read the small print on the back. Planting depth, row spacing, days to first germination. The patient, ordinary information of things that grow slowly and reward the waiting. "9 misses," he said. "I heard your team on the range for the first time 3 weeks ago, from the maintenance road, and I counted 9 misses in a single morning session. That number told me something precise. Not about the wind. The wind at Ironhawk has always been complicated. That's the nature of this range. It told me about who was shooting. A team with your equipment and training doesn't miss 9 consecutive shots because of conditions. It misses because it has stopped looking past its instruments at what the instruments cannot show." He set the seed packet in the crook of his arm. "I had been watching a young woman on that range every morning for 3 weeks, watching whether she would learn to trust her instruments over her eyes, or her eyes over her instruments. Every morning she came to that fence before the team arrived, and she looked at the range with nothing in her hands. Every morning for 3 weeks. He looked at Holt evenly. That told me she was ready to receive something, and that it was time to open the gate. Holt absorbed this. "The rifle," he said. "The rifle," Ray confirmed. They stood in the quiet of the Saturday afternoon hardware store, and the silence between them had the comfortable quality of two men who have arrived, by very different routes, at a shared understanding that does not require further elaboration to be complete. I owe her an apology, Holt said. I expect she is aware of that, Ray said. Whether she needs to hear it spoken is between the two of you, and not something I can tell you. What she needs from you on the range is what every Marine under your command needs from you. Your full attention and the genuine willingness to be wrong about what you think you already know. Give her that consistently, and the apology is present in every session without needing to occupy any additional air. Holt looked at him for a long, settled moment. Then he nodded, the slow, final nod of a man integrating something real into the structure of how he intends to operate from here forward. Good luck with the tomatoes, sir, he said. Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant. Ray looked at the bag still in Holt's hand. That fertilizer is too high in nitrogen for a September lawn application. You want a balanced, slow-release formula at this point in the season. Next aisle over. Holt looked at the bag, looked back at Ray. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. He put the bag back on the shelf. Ray watched him go, and then turned back to the seed display and stood there in the quiet of the Saturday afternoon, examining the small printed information on the back of a mortgage lifter tomato packet with the same quality of careful, unhurried attention he brought to a firing range in the hour before dawn. After a moment, he placed the packets in his basket and walked toward the register. Outside the store's front window, passing on the sidewalk with the particular upright and unhurried pace of someone who knows exactly where they are going, a figure moved through Ray's line of sight. He caught the movement through the plate glass and looked up from his basket. Marin Voss. Civilian clothes, the M40 case slung over one shoulder, moving in the direction of the parking lot that served the range access road half a mile to the north. Even at a distance, through glass, in clothes that carried no rank or designation, she moved like someone who had recently become more fully and completely herself. Ray watched her until she passed out of view. He paid for his items and walked out into the Saturday afternoon sun, which was warm and direct, and without any of the layered complication of marine air. He stood beside his truck in the parking lot and looked up at the sky for a moment, not for information, not to calculate or prepare, simply to know what was there. The wind was coming off the ocean, clean and consistent, running in a single direction with no reversals, no false signals, nothing in it that would mislead a reader who was paying attention. He had been in the Marine Corps for 22 years. He had trained men and one woman, and had watched some of them go to places from which they did not return. He had carried the weight of Dana Voss's death for 30 years in the particular way that teachers carry the deaths of students. Not with guilt, which would have been self-indulgent, but with the sense of a sentence interrupted at the moment its full meaning was becoming clear. He had kept a rifle on a range for 30 years and walked the perimeter of that range for 11 of those years, which some people might have called grief or stubbornness or an old man's inability to release what was already gone. He called it patience. He called it the willingness to let something arrive in its own time rather than forcing it into the shape of your own need, your own schedule, your own sense of when things ought to be completed. Marin Voss had arrived. She had stood at the fence and read the wind with her hands empty and her eyes fully open, the way her mother had stood at that same stretch of fence 4 decades earlier when she was first learning what the wind at this particular range was willing to tell a person who was willing to listen for it. And the sentence that had been interrupted in 1994 had resumed itself, had found its continuation, and was moving now toward the end it had always been moving toward. He got into the truck. He set the bag on the passenger seat. He sat without starting the engine for a long moment, in the particular stillness of a man who is not rushing toward the next thing, because the thing that needed doing has been done. Then from the direction of the range access road half a mile to the north, carried across the still September air with the clarity that comes when the atmosphere is honest and the conditions are right. A single shot. Sharp, clean. The voice of a rifle he knew more intimately than almost anything else he had ever known. 2.5 seconds of absolute silence. And then, faint but entirely unmistakable, traveling across half a mile of clean Pacific air, the sound of steel. Ray sat with his hands on the steering wheel and his eyes forward, in the small, settled smile of a man who required no spotting scope, no data, no confirmation beyond what he had already heard to know exactly what had just happened on that range. He started the truck. He drove home through the Saturday afternoon with the Pacific wind steady at his back, running clean and true and in one direction, with nothing in it to mislead anyone who was paying the right kind of attention. He already knew where everything was going. He had known since the morning, 11 days ago, when he walked through the gate at Iron Hawk Range for the first time in 11 years and found a young woman lying on a shooting mat with her eyes closed and her hands still, and the wind moving across her the way it moves across something that belongs in the landscape, without resistance, without deflection, as if she had always been exactly where she was. She had been listening to the wind, and the wind, for the first time in a very long time, had nothing left to hide.